just after Passover, Yeshua went up to the Nazareth area, and on his way up there, they stopped by one of the village of the Samaritans. The 4th chapter of the Gospel of John details this, and he stopped by a village called Shechem, which is what the Arabs now call Nablus, but it was there that Jacob's well was, and the parcel of land that he gave to Joseph. Yeshua sent his disciples on into town, and he sat down by a well. It was about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. He was pretty weary, and at that point, it was about an 18-hour walk from Jerusalem. And we have friends that lived in that area, so they walked up to Jerusalem for the feast and walked home. So we know it's about 18 hours. And so you can imagine he was a little bit weary at the time, and he sent his disciples on into town to buy some provisions for the trip. And while he was sitting there, a woman, a Samaritan woman, came up to the well to draw water. And he said, "Woman, give me some water to drink, please." And she responded, "How is it that you, being a Jew, ask a drink of me, a Samaritan woman? The Jews don't have any dealings with the Samaritans. Like, you're going to ask a favor of me, but yet you Jews shun us?" And he said, now, to give you a little bit of background, why this really is the case, why the Jews shunned the Samaritans, is that the Jews knew that the Samaritans are not of the tribes of Israel. They're not Jews, they're not Israelites. We know that at the time that Shalmaneser carried away the 10 northern tribes, he then brought in people from the land of Sumer, and he brought them into the area of the 12 northern tribes so that they would inhabit their villages, they would take over their businesses, their farms, they would pay tribute. And when these people came into the land and inhabited the land, there was a problem. Lions were eating the people. And so they thought that they were not in synchronization with the gods of the land. And so what the emperor did is he brought back priests from those who were carried away, and he brought them back to teach the Sumerians or the Samaritans. Now, we have a little bit of a problem because we know who these priests are. Back at the time when the kingdom split, and Rehoboam then was the king over Judea, and Rehoboam was the king there. Jeroboam was the king over the area of the north. At that time, they set up a golden calf at Bethel and at Dan, and Jeroboam said, "These are the gods that brought you out of the land of Egypt." And then they forsook all of the feast of the Lord and began to keep another feast. Now, because Jeroboam said, if they go up to Jerusalem, if they go back to Judea, up to Jerusalem, for the feast of Sukkot, then their hearts will be reunited with Rehoboam, and I'll lose my kingdom, and I'll probably lose my life. And so he changed the feast of the Lord and said that we will have a feast in the 8th month, not the 7th month, but the 8th month. And when we have that feast in the 8th month, it'll be like the Feast of Sukkot, but it won't be the Feast of Sukkot. So that is when they began adding in pagan sun god worship, which was always part of the problem in this part of the world. In fact, that's why the Canaanites were ejected from the land, because they were into Babylonian sun god worship. They brought it over from Babylon into this area. And when the iniquities of the Amorites, the Canaanites, was to a full, then the Israelites could inhabit this land. Now, we see that what Jeroboam did was brilliant. He didn't take Levites, but he took the lowest of the people, the uneducated, and they were uneducated in the Torah. And he then ordained them. He set them up with 501c3 tax-exempt nonprofit corporations called the Church in Northern Israel, in which they could exact their 10% religion tax from the people. But yet they did not know the Torah, and they basically would do anything that the government told them to do. These are the priests that are being brought back into the land. And so these priests are teaching the Samaritans how to worship God, and one of the things that they teach, which went along with the government, was thou shalt worship on Mount Gerizim. which is right overlooking Shem, which is where the well is. Now this woman that is sitting there, came to the well, and Yeshua is there asking for a drink. This is the situation. She's a Samaritan. The Jews have no dealings with the Samaritans because they know that they're not Israelites to begin with. They have a different Torah. They have different commandments, and it is because of these priests teaching a government state religion that was put in place at the time of the 10 northern tribes being carried away and the Samaritans then coming into the land. Now we find out that there are actually, according to the Samaritan high priest, 267 changes in the Torah text from what the Jews use to what the Samaritans use, and many of these changes are part of this new church-state religion that was being put in place, sanctified by the government to keep the people happy and keep them worshiping there at Mount Gerizim and keep them separated from the rest of the Israelites and from Judah. He said, "Give me to drink, please." And she said that you Jews have nothing to do with us. Why is it that you're asking this? And he said, well, if you knew who was speaking with you, you would have asked of him a drink, and he would have given you living water. And she said, okay, are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us this well, who he fed his flocks here, he watered his flocks here? Are you greater? And he said that he that drinks of this water will thirst again. But he that drinks of the water that I am offering will never thirst again, but it will be a wellspring flowing up into eternal life. She said, sir, I'd like some of this water. Then he said, go call your husband. She said, I have no husband. And then he said, you are right. You don't have any husband. You have had 5 husbands. The man that you're now with is not even your husband. He could have told her a lot more detail right then, but this was the overview of what he spoke to her. And right then, she knew that maybe for the first time in her life, she is in the presence of a prophet. She is in the presence of a Jewish man that she doesn't know. He's made a rather large claim, and now he has just told her her whole life story. And she said, sir, I perceive that you're a prophet. Now, as soon as she knows that she's in the presence of a prophet, she has a theological question. She says, our fathers say that we should worship here on this mountain, on Mount Gerizim. It's the 10th commandment in our Torah text. But the Jews say that we should worship at Jerusalem. What do you say? And then he goes into giving her some meat in which he is prophesying about the time that the Almighty desired all the time to be worshipped in spirit and in truth. And this is the time that there is going to be a breakthrough in that area. And while she then talked, as they talked back and forth, she said that finally, I know that when the Messiah comes, he's going to teach us all things. We know that. I know that. I really don't understand everything that you're saying, but I know that when the Messiah comes, he's going to teach us all these things. He's going to answer all of our questions. He's going to settle this whole problem of between the Samaritans and the Jews. And Yeshua said, the one that's speaking to you right now is he. She dropped her bowl. She left it there and took off on a dead run back into the village. As she was on her way back into the village, all of the disciples were on their way out of the village. They had just brought provisions, and I can imagine as she ran by them, their jalabias and turbans blew back in the wind as she was heading back to town, and they got out to the well, and as they were sitting around the well, they said, well, what's going on there? They wondered why they were talking with this Samaritan woman out there. And then the disciples got out their provisions, said, Lord, would you like a little Thousand Island dressing on your Reuben sandwich? And he said, no thanks. I have meat to eat that you know not of. And he is seeing what's taking place because the woman went back into the village and she went out into the street and she said, I just met a man that told me everything that I ever did in my life. Is not this the Messiah? And the people heard her, they listened to her, and then they decided that they were going to come out of the village. Now, the Samaritans then wore all white. They wore white jalabias, they dressed in all white, and the men and the women in the village. And Joshua is looking on past his disciples back at the village because he has seen what's happened and what is about to take place. And when he said that, I've got meat to eat that you know not of, they said, look, wrong. Okay, what's going on? You were starving an hour ago before we went into town, and now you don't have any appetite. Has somebody given you something to eat? I've got meat to eat that you know not of. And then he said, do not say there are yet 4 months, and then comes the harvest. And at that time, there were about 4 months before the fall harvest began. He said, lift up your eyes. Look on the hills. Look, the fields are white, all ready to harvest. And as they turned and looked, they saw hundreds and hundreds of men in white jalabias coming out of the city, coming out to where he was at the well. When they arrived, they talked to him. They questioned him. And as he taught them, they said, we heard what the woman said, but we really didn't believe because of what she said. We came out to listen to you. But now that we're here, now that we hear these words, we know that you are the Messiah. And so the scripture says that he went into the village and stayed with those Gentiles for 2 days. For 2 days. I somehow recall a day with the Lord being as 1,000 years and 1,000 years being as a day. Remember, this is the first place that he has spoken to anyone and said that he was the Messiah. It was to a Gentile woman. It was to a Samaritan that he spoke those words. He that speaks unto you am he. He is the Messiah. Now all these men come out and they say, we know you're the Messiah. The Gentiles recognized it first, and they welcomed him into the city, and he stayed with them for 2 days. Now after those 2 days, he came on up to Nazareth. He ministered here in this area. And then at the end of the summer, and we discussed this during the tour of the last couple of days, of what transpired during that summer, some of the different synagogues that he was in, that we were in, and where he taught, where he ministered, where he healed. And as we spoke about this, that from this area, to get from Nazareth and from the Galilee to get to Jerusalem for the Feast of Sukkot takes some advanced planning. The month of Elul is the time of the harvest. And when the trumpet, the Yom Teruah, the Day of Trumpets, which begins the 7th month, when that takes place, no one is required to go up to Jerusalem. That's not a pilgrimage feast. And what happens 10 days after that, in which we do the final winnowing out and we bring in, is collect all of the produce and all for that year. We have that 10 days to get ready. But then we have the Day of Atonement. The Day of Atonement is also not a pilgrimage feast. That wherever you are, you fast, and you pray on the Day of Atonement. And then 5 days later, we must be up in Jerusalem, already having built our sukkahs and ready to enter into the sukkah on the first day of the Feast of Sukkot, which is the 15th day of the month. Now, it takes at least 7 days traveling on foot to get from the Galilee area up to Jerusalem. Now, that's difficult because we have the Day of Atonement that happens 5 days before Sukkot. We have the harvest, and this is the bountiful, plentiful area of produce for the land of Israel, just overflowing then and now. In fact, the village where I live is Poria, which means fruitful, a very fruitful area, the whole Jezreel Valley here. And so they had to leave before the Day of Atonement, and then on their way up, they would stop and fast during the Day of Atonement. And that's what we talked about yesterday, that the Day of Atonement on their way to Jerusalem, that they stopped on a mountaintop, and that is where appeared Moses and Eliyahu. Moses and Elijah appeared, and that's why the disciples say, it's good for us to be here. Let's build 3 sukkahs here, one for you, one for Elijah, and one for Moses. They knew that they wanted to kill him back at Jerusalem. In fact, here in Nazareth, his brothers and his mother were going up to the feast and said, I'm not going up yet. Because sending them ahead, they would expect that as the whole village traveled up, as they came into town, they would expect him to be in that company, but he came up covertly because he knew that the religious leaders wanted to kill him. His disciples knew that. So they said, this is obviously a blessed place. Let's do it here. Let's have the feast here. Let's stay on this mountain. And that's when the voice came out of heaven. You listen to my beloved son. You guys have some really crazy ideas. And the Lord said, let's go. We're going up to Jerusalem. At the end of the Feast of Sukkot, then he is on his way up to the Feast of Sukkot, traveling after the Day of Atonement. He's still 18 hours out of Jerusalem. He stops by the well, and now he stays with all of his disciples at the well because they've just got 18 more hours to go. They're going to be in Jerusalem. They're getting ready for the feast. He sends James and John into the same village that they were earlier that year, at the beginning of the summer. They go into the village where he spent 2 days with those Gentiles who proclaimed that he was the Messiah. They believed that he was the Messiah. But when James and John go into the village, they refuse to sell anything to James and John. Why? It says that when the Samaritans, when they knew that Yahshua set his face as though he would go up to Jerusalem, they refused to sell him anything. Okay, what's going on here? They said they knew he was the Messiah. He spent 2 days with them. Now he's going up to the fall feast of the Lord, and they refuse to sell anything. Why? Because if he is not going to stay with them and build his sukkah on Mount Gerizim area, and he is not going to worship with them, if he's not going to play religion with them the way these Gentiles have been playing religion all this time, they're not even going to sell him anything. If you don't want to play religion with us, you can just pack your trash and keep going, Jesus. We don't need you. We don't want you. We're not even going to sell you anything. James and John came back and they were so furious. They were livid. They said, Lord, let's call fire down from heaven and toast their worthless carcasses right now. And he said, calm down, boys. You don't know what spirit you're of. Come on, follow me. Follow me. They went up to Jerusalem and they kept the fall feast, the Feast of Tabernacles. As we walked through that Samaritan village a few years ago, on the first day of the Feast of Sukkot, we saw so many children on crutches. Their bodies were twisted. They had to have help walking. We went into the home of the high priest, and his 3 sons One of them will eventually be the high priest. I know which one already, because two of them are so severely retarded they cannot carry on a coherent conversation at all. What happened is that the Samaritans kept their religion, they kept separated, they kept doing their own thing, and they became so severely inbred that there is not a single family that does not have severely retarded and twisted and deformed offspring. They might have 6, 7, 8, 10 children, but out of all those children there will be one girl. All of them are very prosperous. But the one thing they fight about are girls, because most men will live and die and never have a wife. They will have big 3-story, 4-story homes. They will be driving their Lexus, their Mercedes, parked in front of the house. But they will never have a wife, because of this inbreeding has caused so many problems. And those that do have a wife, many of their children, not just one or two, but many of their children will be deformed. I believe that Yahshua told his disciples, no, we're not going to call fire down from heaven. We are going to just let this be. And in the end days, in the last days, people will see an example. If we want to follow the doctrines and commandments of men, the religious rules and regulations of men, if we want to cloister ourselves into our own denominational enclaves and then inbreed generation after generation after generation, we will finally develop to where we can bear no good fruit. Our offspring will be twisted, gnarled, and retarded. They could have followed him up to Jerusalem. They would have been welcome. But instead, they wanted to continue to play religion their own way. And so now, in our generation, we have the example of the woman at the well. We have the example of the Gentiles that inbred and for 2,000 years have known who the Messiah is, and the question is, now are they going to follow him? Or are they going to continue to follow their dead traditions that will end up with everyone twisted and warped? This is one of the reasons I love being here at the Nazareth village, a first century village in the very hometown, probably in the neighborhood. Yeshua probably walked right through this vineyard. Probably knew the family that ran this vineyard. And from here, he went all over the Galilee, ministering, healing. And I believe that if we follow him, we will experience the same healing in our lives, spiritually, physically, emotionally, and we will be able to take that healing out to the nations of the world. This is the Galilee region, is it not? Galilee of the nations. So, I was teaching one evening, and a woman came up to me and she said, I had a vision and I want to share it with you. And her husband was there, and I felt like I need to hear this. And she said that she saw a vision in which the Lord was standing in all white garments, and he was off just a little bit, and he motioned, didn't say anything, motion. And he turned around and walked a good distance, and then he turned around. And they turned around and walked. And then finally, one last time, he looked back, and he turned around, never looked back again, and just kept going. And soon as I saw that, As soon as she said it, it was like I saw the picture, and I knew why she had received that revelation, that vision. Yeshua is saying, follow me. Come on, follow me. And he turns around and walks away. See who's following. He turns around and says, come on, follow me. I want you to leave your dead traditions behind. I want you to leave your dead religion behind, and I want you to just follow me. Come on, follow me. And then he walked quite a ways, and just one last time, he says, follow me. And he turns around, and he never looks back again. It's going to be a remnant. Right now, the remnant doesn't exist. The remnant doesn't exist. The remnant is what remains at the end. We're not even close to the end. The heat has not been turned up yet. We live in peace and tranquility. But there's a time coming that we have got to be right on his heels and listening to his voice and doing what he said, or we'll get left in the dust. He says, follow him, and I think that's what we need to do. Amen?